we will walk through how to diagram a standard form sorites. I'm going to split this into two parts. So in the first part, we will symbolize the argument and then talk about how to split the argument into two subarguments. Then in the next tutorial, I will diagram the subarguments and we'll talk about what the diagrams mean. Okay, so we're going to start by symbolizing the argument. And you'll notice I'm using letters that basically correspond to the classes. So B, bloodhounds, D, dogs, so on. Rather than using S, P, and M like we did in the standard form categorical syllogisms. And that's because the terms, major term and minor term and middle term don't really have the same meaning when we get to a sorites, because we're going to have a couple of middle terms and a couple of major terms and minor terms. So we're just not going to worry about that. And we're not trying to identify the mood or the figure of the argument, so we don't need to worry about it. So we don't need to have those letters that way. I mean, you don't need to have those letters in order to identify the mood and figure. It just makes it easier. Okay, so the first premise is all B are D. The second one is all D are M. And the third one is no F R M. And the conclusion is no F R B. Okay, so then we need to split the argument into two subarguments. And we do that by grouping together two premises that have some term in common. So we could either group together P1 and P2 because they have D in common, or P2 and P3 because they have M in common. So from the start, it doesn't really matter how we choose to do this. I'm going to just do P1 and P2 because they're first, and why not? Now, once we diagram the arguments, we might want to change things. Once we've diagrammed the first subargument, because if we diagram this first subargument and there isn't a valid conclusion that comes out of it, then we're going to want to try the other option. We're going to want to try P2 and P3 together and see if a valid conclusion follows from that. Because if there is no conclusion that follows validly from P1 and P2, we don't know what to put here. We do know some things. We know it's going to have a B and an M in it because of those are the two terms that are in the premises. And we can guess that it'll probably be a universal statement because we have two universal statements. But we don't know really how it's going to be set up. And what tells us how it's set up is the Venn diagram. So if the Venn diagram doesn't succeed in doing that, then we might want to try the other way. I mean, we could just make up something. We could be like, well, I'm going to say it's all B or M. Because if there's no conclusion that follows validly from the premises, then really any conclusion is good as another. But I just find it easier to start with one that's valid to begin with. Okay, and then this one is going to have no FRM. It's going to have that leftover conclusion, that leftover premise we haven't used. And then the other premise will be whatever this conclusion turns out to be. And then the conclusion of this argument will be the conclusion of the argument as a whole. Alright, so in the next tutorial we will try and diagram first this subargument and find out what the conclusion is, and then diagram this